我就没有了，我不给了。大哥，你不会吃吧？
你咋知道我不会吃呢？对，那得看是谁。你啥时候去拿锅啊？
今天晚上好吧？明天你怕你回来。他这么多吗？
这飞速有人找。之后，我再移到巡航完之后再巡拉进去。为什么你不跟你的小伙伴坐在一起？
坐不下了，
每天我们俩就坐在一起。没所谓了。
不用这样。
Okay, so just to give you a heads up, I updated the information on EdShare about the coursework. So if you go to our timetable on the wiki and go to coursework, you'll get through to this year's coursework information. So that's there. The thing that we probably didn't speak about in depth is that the mark scheme's on there, which gives you the breakdown for which of the learning outcomes that you're addressing with this and how much the marks are worth for each of the parts. Also gives you details about the hand-in, a little bit more detail about the problem. Also on there's the slides that I used yesterday, there's a link to the starting point, and there is an FAQ which is a link over at the ECS wiki. So it's got some questions that were asked last year. I've updated them hopefully to reflect what we're doing this year. And if there are any other common questions, I'll tag them on here, so it's always worth having a look on here to see if there's any updates. Okay, are there any questions about coursework? Possibly.
Yeah, how the fuck do you do it?
Start at the beginning and use all the things we taught you, like all the coursework.
Yeah, the first bit, like, we've done a reasonable amount, I would say, because we had to do the practical for the HTML bit and the CSS. So as a complete, listening things, I could just about contangle some hideous piece of HTML that you're going to do. When it comes to the second bit, I can make a mental map of what I might want to happen. I could do that bit. The other bit, I can't even describe it because I don't know what it is. It's completely gone over my head. I'd say the people like me who've got no experience whatsoever in any of this, it's a bit of a hard task with all the only couple of lectures in it. What do you think?
No, it's a 4-year master's module. No, seriously, like there's an element of independent learning here. You're on a degree that has prerequisites that allow you to do this. this is nowhere near as technical as we could have made the coursework. In fact, in previous years, the coursework was to write an entire bit of software to do this. I think this is very much pitched at a level that everyone in this class can. Like, I changed it last year when I came onto the module because it was such an inappropriate coursework before, and I definitely think, like, given last year's experience as well, this is definitely at a level that everyone in this class can do. Like, truly and honestly. No, absolutely. Be positive about it. Tackle it. Speak to other people in the course. Speak to other people with you, and ask questions. If there are things that we can help with, then we will. But you'll definitely be able to do it. I can get you to talk to some people from last year if you want.
I do talk to people from last year. I know.
They all passed the coursework.
Yeah, I just think might need to quite. You know, it's just a tough argument. You've never done anything like that before. I just get that the bit about requesting things, getting things back, and quite sort of gone.
It will take some practice. We'll see if we can get some support as well. So I've got a couple of postgrads who are meant to be helping with this. So
yeah, I've had an email when we asked about it. So on Wednesday I will go in for that.
That will help a lot. As you practice more, it will become easier and you'll get what's going on, and that will then apply directly to the coursework. Okay, so today's topic. This is sort of, I'm going to kick it off with a bit of discussion and get you guys to think about this, but then I'll go through some examples and highlight some best practice. Because the first bit of your coursework is to write the documentation for an existing REST API, I thought it would be a good idea to look at what some of the things you might expect to see in good documentation for these sort of APIs. And have a look at some sort of examples from the wild to see what we can come up with. But as I say, we're going to kick off by getting you guys to think about it. So I'm going to get you to spend 5 minutes discussing with the person next to you. And the first thing I'd like you to do is remind yourself what those 3 architectural bases of the web architecture are. So write those down. That should just be a matter of recall or looking back in the slides. But then I want, like, in relation to each of those, how do they relate to something being RESTful? Why are they important parts of the REST architecture? And then consider what you might do to document these. What's the importance of each of them? How would you order them? How would you represent them? How would you display them? So that someone who is trying to use your API is able to get all the information that they need to be able to do that. Okay, so I'm going to put a timer on, we'll come back in 5 minutes and we'll discuss some of what we thought about that. Okay, so turn to the person next to you.
I've got it. What is it? I've got it on the last. I just add it.
我不知道他说的啥意思。
关键是REST 的 interface 关键是方面，你知道吗？我查一下吧。
我这个真不知道啥，只会用我靠，不知道。 对呀、啊，那不是，那你 I 也不对呀、
I 是那层啊，就是 what are the activities outside of the就我到现在也不知道那个
发送报文，反馈报文，发送方法，请求返回。你传输的数据类型就多了，它的报文报文也是，
但是你要做定义啊，你要在哪个问题定义啊？
那就是发送报文，返回报文，我觉得是，还有发送的方法。
表示状态传递。
request 的那个上周五都没讲他。representation 是什么意思？
So questions were, what are the three architectural bases of the web, what are the key aspects of RESTful APIs and how they relate to those architectural bases, and how do you document each of these. So let's start at the top. So what were the architectural bases? The clue was that they begin with I, R, and I. Oh, one at a time. Hand up, hand up. You didn't put your hand up. He had his hand up. Identification. What do we mean by that? What does that refer to?
Are the URIs or URLs?
Absolutely. What's the difference?
The difference is that the URI is standard and the URL is more specific.
Sort of, yeah. So a URI is anything that identifies, whereas a URL is one of those things that begins with HTTP and has that sort of format. I think that's a distinction. Someone will probably correct me. Nick would definitely correct me. Ask Nick the next time you see him, what's the difference between a URI and a URL? He'll blow out the entire lecture. That would just be Nick talking about URIs and URLs for the rest of it. Any suggestions? Hang on. What did you want to say? Was it identification? Did you get any of the others? Hands up. Hand up. Who wants to say something? Which one are we going for? Presentation. That doesn't begin with any of those letters.
What did you say?
It's hard, isn't it?
Representation.
Sorry.
Representation.
What do we mean by representation?
Yeah, what do we mean? Yes, a
that's a good
document,
question.
email document, or an audio, or a video, all of this can be a representation.
Format for documents.
Wait for it.
Do you want to answer that?
No, I was just saying, like, you know, like format for document. He thinks is
Interesting.
that's interaction. That's what I'm saying.
I think. Oh, I don't know. Right. The question at the front is hypermedia, so the linking bit. What does that fall under? What does that fall into? Is it identification, representation, or whatever the third one is? Should we get the third one on the board? Someone tell us what the third one is. Hands up. Interaction. Interaction. What's interaction? How do you interact with it? But can't define a word using the word itself. That's cheating. How you communicate it. Yeah. So then the question was, where does hypermedia fit into this? Which of these does it do? Does anyone want to posit an answer?
Hypermedia, I think, goes under format, representation.
Representation. Why? Argue your case. Why?
Because when you represent, you also represent a hypermedia.
What do you mean by hypermedia?
Something that you represent. Anything that you represent is a hypermedia.
No. Okay, well, we'll make that point. Let's have a few more.
Resources.
Resources. Is that representations as well?
Resources.
I think like resource you could use for this. Yeah, it's the same. Like representation, resource. It's like the resource is the thing. A representation, I guess, is like how do you display that thing? How do you communicate about that thing? Go on, are you going to tell us about that?
Hypermedia is like a document. There is a link pointer to another document or another page.
Absolutely. So the key thing about hypermedia is there's a link. But where does that fit into this whole thing? Well, so personally, I think it's the thing that joins all of these. Honestly, so the link appears in the representation. You only get the link if you put an anchor tag in your HTML. Without that, the link doesn't exist. What do you put in the anchor tag? Well, you put a URI, and that's identification. So without identification, you can't do the hypermedia. You've got no way of saying what are you pointing at? What's at the other end of the link? And then without interaction, you've got no way of resolving that. So you need interaction as well to be able to take that URI and do something with it, to like go and get it or send something to it. So I think really hypermedia ties all three of these together. You've got to have all of them. Probably the most visible place it sits is in the representation because you can see it, but it makes use of identification and interaction to exist. Without those, we wouldn't be able to have hypermedia. Answer the question? Cool. Okay, right. Moving on from that recap. So, how does this fit in with what we were talking about REST? So, can anyone describe REST in terms of these architectural parts? Yeah, please.
Well, I wasn't sure if I was on the right thing because of interface.
Okay.
Versus some of the, I can't remember the exact word in the slide, but one of them was client-server, I believe, in terms of an aspect that helps REST function.
Okay.
So the division of concerns between one basis to hold the representations.
Yeah.
But in a way, they kind of tie towards it because you need the identifier to point to the server.
Yeah.
But you also need the client to put that in. The representation happens on the client through browsers and viewports, but also is determined by the format of the document on the server. And then the interaction itself between the two is how the representation gets transferred.
Absolutely.
So
Yep.
it's quite a lot, but that's, yeah.
Yes, I think
They're
that
all kind of
the key thing in there was that like we're dealing with creating an interface between some service that exists on our server, so our server machine, and some client that is viewing this, that is interacting with this. So yeah, that's a key part of the REST architecture that we were talking about the other week.
is that REST interface though, in this architecture, the interface could be different in terms of it being the API. Is there a difference between those terms?
Between API and interface?
Well, I know one's an application, I mean, architecture versus that's not API inherently contains.
So this is the architecture that exists, and we're talking like how REST is what sits in that API, in that interface in between. So REST is what allows us to do that communication in between the client and the server. Anything else we want to add about REST in relation to these? Shall I do a little recap? Okay, right, I'll talk about it. So, where REST fits into all of this is that we're making use of each of these, the interaction, the identification, representation, to work as a standard format for being able to provide web services, and provide them using technologies that lots of people are comfortable with and used to. So a lot of web services that were built in the late 90s were either completely bespoke and completely sort of arbitrary. They were designed by the person providing the service, and they followed those particular standards. Or they followed a standard called SOAP, which was a very, very heavyweight way of doing this communication. And it sort of, it was difficult to develop for. It was difficult to make web services that produce this. It was difficult to consume web services. It was difficult to write software that would take information from these web services. So there was a shift towards making web services that used REST under the proposal that by using these various parts of the web architecture, we can make web services that benefit from all the technologies that make the web good. So all the elements of what makes the World Wide Web good, we can use for our web services and make not just for human website interactions, but for all sorts of for machine and web interactions. So, how do we fit into each of these? So, our web services end up making use of each of these elements. we use identification to talk about the resources within our web service. So we take the service that we're providing and create resources within that. We make resources within that to refer to. So we identify those resources within the application. We use representation to do that information transferal. And typically this then has to be in a machine readable representation. So we've spoken a lot about HTML, which is designed for humans to be able to interpret, or at least for it to be rendered for humans to interpret. But we start looking for RESTful services at formats that allow machines to interpret, so XML, JSON, things like that, data formats rather than document formats. And of course we need to, when we have a web service, there are various tasks that we need to do, but typically they involve either retrieving information from the web service or sending information to the web service to make a change, to make an update. And that's where HTTP fits in. We're then able to do make use of what HTTP gives us to do interaction. So, I am going to, through a set of examples, frame good REST interface documentation in terms of each of these. Let's speak about how, what that looks like and what an API looks like through its documentation. And what are some examples? First example, we're going to talk about identification. So these are three example documentation system of setups from various REST APIs from big-ish companies. We've got PayPal, we've got the WordPress API, I think it's not right, the Twitter API and the WordPress API. And the way they document their identification are through these sort of URI parameters. Yeah, go on, we'll have a question.
When we have to do the documentation, can we use a API syntax and then have it generate documentation?
Don't see why not.
So I can use API blueprint.
Sorry?
I can use API blueprint.
Send me an email, I'll check and clarify. What do we have here? What can we see here? We see the documentation telling us how to construct URIs to be able to access various parts of the API. So in the WordPress example, it's showing you how to get a particular post on a particular site. And the URI template represents that. On PayPal, it's about updating a particular payment that's been created and requested. On Twitter, it's about updating the status, sending a tweet. But the thing to notice about these, or at least in the PayPal and the WordPress examples, is they use a certain syntax, although it's different in both cases, a certain syntax to indicate that they're talking about a value that might change, that you have to modify before you get a valid URI. So all of these bits with plain text, so like V1 payment, are what you put in the URI and sites and posts. But these bits you can't quite see it in this one. This one's sort of greyed out and it's got some brackets around it. And in the WordPress one, they use $ signs to represent this. But you could use square brackets, angle brackets, something to indicate that it's not part of the URI text. And what this is indicating is that this is some sort of variable. This is going to change when you create an actual one of these URIs. So in WordPress, you'd have the word site, you'd replace the word $site with some number that indicates that identifies the site. Then you'd have the word posts, then you'd replace post ID with the number, the ID that represents that post. But in fact, let's point out the odd one in the room. The Twitter one doesn't have any parameters in it. You just post directly to it. In fact, that puts it quite low on that Richardson, on the pyramid of Richardson's maturity model, because it's just it's what do they call that? Plain old XML. You're posting to one URI to be able to do this. Okay. I highlighted it as well. So it's just pointing out the parameters and how they document those parameters. So those bits at the end are then referred to later in the documentation. So on PayPal, they tell you what a payment ID is. They tell you that it's a string. They tell you it's the ID of the payment that you want to update. On WordPress, site and post ID, it tells you the type. So the site can be an integer, a number, or a string. The post ID can be an integer, and it tells you that it's the ID of the domain or the ID of the post. So for URIs, for APIs that have this sort of URI building, that their URIs follow a common template, then it's important in the documentation to reflect what this template is. So the developers, people who are writing software to access this API, know how to decode that and how to create those URIs. Interaction. You'll notice that like identification, parameters, and interaction all gets like highlighted very like in the same place all up front on most of these documentations. What's the plural of documentation? This is about which of those HTTP methods do you use to do this task. So the task will be like titled update payment. But what do you do to that? You don't get an update payment because a get doesn't do a change. It doesn't have an effect. It just retrieves information. In this case, they're using the patch HTTP method. So patch is a method for doing updates, for doing changes, as opposed to retrieving or creating for the first time. The WordPress one's a good example of a get. So this is for, what do they call it? Retrieving a single post called post ID. You do a get. It's the appropriate interaction method for doing that. And Twitter, because it's sending a post, sending a status, and it's not updating one, it's not changing one. It uses a post method. If you search around, you can find there's quite a lot of discussion about when's it best to use post, when's it best to use patch, when's it best to use put, because there's a couple of there's slightly different semantics for each of those. It's probably best to read the conversation around that rather than taking a fixed view of it. Okay, another part of the interaction. We know that when we use HTTP to do a request, part of the response is that we get a code to say what the result was like. And it's important for the documentation to tell developers what to expect in terms of this. So developers can write their software to react in different ways depending on the response. So they need to know what the responses are likely to be. PayPal only tells you one thing. It tells you if it was successful, you get a HTTP 204. That's the only thing you find out. Twitter's not very useful either. Twitter's got a lot of text explaining why you might get 403, which is if you're trying to post the same tweet twice, then it will reject it. It will give you a 403. WordPress though, way better. It gives you a whole bunch of different error codes that you might get and why that might have happened. So things like a 404 if the post doesn't actually exist. If you're trying to update a post that given a particular URI that you think exists, but it's not there, you'll get a 404. Or 403 unauthorized if you're not allowed to, if you're not logged in or you're not the owner of that blog post, then you obviously can't update it. While we're here though, I'm just going to point out the ridiculous description of the Twitter post status update. Updates the authenticating user's current status, also known as tweeting. In case you hadn't pieced together what our status update was on Twitter, and why they call it something different other than just tweeting. Okay, so documentation is important to describe what to expect from the interaction layer. What are we going to get back? And the final thing to mention about interaction are those dastardly HTTP headers. In the wild, in practice, Very few APIs make use of HTTP headers, which I think is criminal, but is the way it is. They will pretty much only use headers to do authorization. So most APIs will have the authorization header and will give you information about what to pass to the authorization header to be able to get a response back. The other thing that's worth being aware of is that they will sometimes use the accept header to let the client choose which data type to get back. So if you're writing a client that can only cope with XML, you might use the HTTP accept header to say that you only want to receive XML. Getting a response in JSON or something else, or HTML wouldn't be appropriate. So you'll see the accept header occasionally, and there's no reason not to use the that an API couldn't use something like the accept language header to only let you only retrieve certain languages of content. Okay, headers. Next up, representation. So, good documentation will tell the developer, tell the reader, what to expect as data elements within the XML or the JSON that they retrieve. So this is WordPress again. WordPress has pretty good documentation. It will tell you each of the elements to expect, the type of data to expect in there, and we've got everything from numerical or numbers, date and time, HTML data, other URIs, and strings. And alongside each of those, a description of what that means. So it's got a short name for the purposes of the data type, such as what one that we're not sure about. Okay, so like URI, but you get a description. The full permanent link URL for this post, so you know what that's referring to. But not all documentation does this, which is bad. Most of them will just use example output to try and represent this, and then it's down to the developer to interpret that data, or like interpret the samples and figure out what to expect back, which is a little bit lazy, but it happens sometimes. So, what do we have here? So, pretty much all of the documentation you'll see in the wild will have an example of what to send to the API. So, WordPress has got a curl line on this was Twitter. It's got the post line that you put into curl or into Telnet, and we don't see the example on PayPal. But importantly, they then have a sample output. In all of these cases, they've used JSON, but you will find APIs that have XML in there. And you'll see they typically, they will indent it so it's readable. Sometimes they syntax highlight it. They present it in a way that's useful for the developer, in a way that someone reading this will be able to understand this. But the best practice is to have that combined with an explanation of what each of the things in that means. So if you look at, like these slides are on edge there, so you can look at the screenshots a little bit more closely. But this is the WordPress one. Each of those elements, each of those parameters will appear in the WordPress example on here. So the author's there, the modified date, the URL, the slug, the short, and so on. Now, the famous hypermedia. Good examples and good APIs that follow hypermedia best practices will have information about that as well. So this is from the PayPal API, one of the few out there that actually do hypermedia well. And as part of their example, part of their sample output for this, if you look right at the end, you'll see that it has an element called links, and within that it's got a list of hrefs that tell you what other things you can do to move out of the current state. So this was, I think this was after updating payment. The option there is to retrieve the current payment. And once you do that, then you'll get other options to move on. Okay, our final thing. Alongside of, well, no, one of the outcomes of this is that you will have lots of different bits of documentation. You will have, for every URI that might exist within your system, so for every URI template, you'll also have all of the methods for each of those URI templates. And you might even within that have multiple examples. It's therefore important to have some way of navigating that easily, and each of the APIs that we've used as examples in this have made use of different ways of structuring that. I'm not going to cast any favoritism on them, but let's just have a look at what the options are. So Twitter's approach is to group everything by method. So it lists all the gets first, then all the posts. Where are we? WordPress lists all of them. So it lists like the method and the template, one after another, and I presume so it's grouping it by type of thing. So these are ones about posts, these are ones about removing posts, these are ones about the user, and so on. And PayPal, again, lists what the method is, what it does, a good description of the like the title and an explanation of what that particular task does. But it just lays them out as blocks rather than as a list. Okay, so to summarize, our documentation needs to tell a developer how to access the API, how to make use of the information from the web service, how to communicate with it. We can consider this in terms of each of those bases of the web architecture. So identification, our documentation has to tell us how to make and interpret the URIs that represent the resources in there. We need lots of information about the interaction. So what methods do we use to communicate with the web service? What do we expect to get back in terms of errors? What do those errors mean? Or like positive HTTP codes as well. And our documentation needs to tell the developer what to expect in terms of representation. What format are they going to get? Is it XML? Is it JSON? Could it be either? And what is the data in there? What does it mean? What are the elements in there? What type of value can they be expected to be? Will there be a number or a string, or a URL, or a date, or whatever? And typically, documentation will show most of the representation through sample output from the API. But that might even be manufactured samples. It might not even be from truly running the API. It's structured by hand to look like the output you'd expect. And because we've got lots of this information, listing the sort of table of contents of all this information is crucial for making it navigable, making it possible for people to find what they're looking for. Okay, right, that's the end of this documentation. Hopefully that's given you a sense of what to expect in terms of making your documentation for the coursework. Hopefully it gives you some ideas of where to go to look at best practices. Inspiration.
大概我问你一个问题。就是我下载那个 Visual Studio，然后我是不是下载放在机旁的？
你为什么要用 Visual Studio 呢？